I feel the hand of history upon our shoulders.
All this tradition of ours, our school history, our songs, this part of the history of our country, all were gone and finished and liquidated.
Thank you so much, gents, for coming on the podcast. It's very exciting. Bamburgh Castle, one of the most famous castles in the world, one of the greatest settings of any castle in the British Isles. And recently, you, Paul, have gone and discovered something that makes it even more remarkable and exciting. Tell us about that.
Well, we've been excavating at Bamburgh since 1997. That was our first excavation. So it's a very long-running process, but we've been excavating the burial ground in the castle and the surrounding area, and we've also got a prehistoric landscape just in from. So it's a huge holistic project based around the village of Bamburgh, which obviously was a much more important site in the early medieval period. Within the context of that, we discovered a burial ground, a vast burial ground from the early medieval period. So it's effectively a burial ground where the great and good of the kingdom of Northumbria were buried in the 5th, 6th and 7th century. So I suppose it's equivalent to Westminster Abbey now. It would have that sort of resonance, really.
Eduardo, you tell me, what was the importance of Bamburgh? What was the importance of that area, and why were all these people buried there in what is now feels like a very remote village almost?
Well, the kingdom of Northumbria became in the 7th century the preeminent kingdom in Britain. After the Romans left, you had Britain dissolving into a series of petty, very small kingdoms. I mean, many barely the size of a shire or something like that. Through the 5th and 6th centuries, these consolidated, and by the 7th century, they'd become larger entities. And of these, Northumbria was both amongst the largest, and through a series of particularly powerful kings, became the most powerful kingdom in Britain, in the Isles. And Bamburgh was essentially their capital, their stronghold. I mean, if you see, even today, when I first went to visit Paul up there, I'd never been to Northumberland, or in fact, I was fairly vague about the existence of Northumberland, to be honest.
Southerner.
Yeah, complete. I was born in London and lived there all my life, so nothing exists much north of Watford. So I still remember arriving at Sea Houses, which is the town just south of Bamburgh, and then driving up the coast road, and literally my jaw dropped open as I saw the castle squatting on its great lump of dolerite. It's the most commanding of positions, and it doesn't take a genius to work out it's the most perfect location for a stronghold, and that's where the kings of Northumbria made their stronghold.
So if history had gone differently, we could be talking about this as the nucleus of an English, of a Northumbrian, of a British state to this day.
Well, there was no a priori reason that Britain would end up split between England, Scotland and Wales. And in fact, it was a series of battles and conflicts during the early medieval period that ended up creating the states that endured afterwards.
Battle of Nectansmere. Yeah, we'll come on to that, guys. Yeah. Very exciting.
And indeed, Heavenfield and so on. All of these battles ended up creating the political entities that we now know today, and that have endured for so long. But there was no reason that they had to work out that way. It's quite easy to imagine an England of much smaller extent. Maybe I think sort of this side of the Pennines, for instance, and things like that. So. The accidents of history.
Let's talk more, Paul, about your work. So, what did you discover? Let's talk about this burial, this figure that you discovered in the burial ground that is just telling us so much about this period.
It's within the context of a much wider cemetery. So, this was only one of 120, I think, we've excavated now. But there's probably in excess of 1,000 burials in the burial ground, just from my calculations based on density and dimensions of the surface area, and probably quite a lot have eroded out. So we're looking at quite a vast cemetery, really spanning probably 3 centuries, between 2.5, 3 centuries. The individual burial is kind of lost in the detail of loads of burials all around it with of different forms. Some are prone, some are crouched. We get some with low-level grave goods, but they're largely Christian burials, largely of men and women who have never really known periods of stress. Their skeletal integrity is complete. They basically have good bones, they have good teeth, they've had a perfectly good diet all through their life. They've never been starved. Quite a few of them have fairly catastrophic battle injuries, effectively. So yeah.
So a good life until they were hacked to death in the Shield Wall.
Yes,
There's
quite
a
possibly.
spectacular
Yeah.
example of that we talk about.
Yeah,
in the book,
one of the burials that's next to the chap in the book that Eddie and I wrote is effectively cut from his shoulder blade down to below his navel, complete diagonal cut. When I first excavated it, when I first saw it, I saw the report anyway, I assumed it would be from a big sort of broad axe, the Danish axe. But we didn't really have a timescale at that point. We knew it was early medieval, but we didn't really know what. But now, I think it's going to be a sword cut, and considering the quality of the swords that have been excavated from Bamburgh, it really is fairly simple to imagine someone. But I think it would have been someone who'd already gone down onto their knees, was probably in the throes of either dying, or they certainly were dying shortly afterwards anyway when someone cut them in half. But it's a very powerful blow from a very skilled warrior. So, talk
to me again more about that. You think the one that we're focusing on today is a 7th century warrior, we think?
Yeah, the C14 puts him around 630 sort of thing at time of death. So from about 610 through to about 640 is the broad range.
And why is this figure so interesting to you?
Because around that time is when Oswald comes back to Northumbria from Dalriada and reclaims the kingdom. So that's really the foundation of the Northumbrian dynasty, really. That when Northumbria goes from being one of many warring polities into becoming a major state, it becomes a pivotal state, really, in the north of England, in England wide, and in Europe. So they have connections with the continent, they have connections with the south, they have connection with the Gaels, with the Picti, and with Ireland. They're very extremely well connected and related. They're all cousins and brothers and sisters, but marrying each other, and they're very sort of interconnected and global. Well, global in the sense of the known world at that stage. So
he wasn't from Northumbria. The tests have shown that he was actually born and brought up in and around Iona. He was Dalriadan. So the question is, how did he end up being buried in the kingly noble grave of Bamburgh? Obviously, he must have died around there, but what was he doing there? And given the dates and then certain other aspects of the grave, we think it's highly likely that he was one of the warriors that came with Oswald to reclaim the throne.
Let's go. So Iona, island off the west coast of Scotland, a wellspring of Christianity, Irish monks reintroducing Christianity to Britain, etc. Controversial, but let's. And what is Dalriada?
Okay, well, it's a sea-spanning kingdom, basically. It's one that...
the forgotten kingdoms of Britain.
Yeah, and it was a fantastic one. It went from Northern Ireland through to basically Argyll in Scotland, with the stronghold of the king in Dunad in Argyll. And Iona was given by the kings of Dalriada to St. Columba when he went into exile. And from there... it became a real centre of Christianity and indeed civilization, really, as in many ways that's what the monks and the nobility were engaged in when it went in. It was almost really a creation of a civilization.
So you've got this very dynamic kingdom, this trans-maritime kingdom in what is now Western Scotland and Northern Ireland. So the kings of Northumberland, are they exiled there and come back? What's the story with Oswald arriving in Northumbria?
Well, he was in exile. He at the age of 12 had to flee into exile with his mother and his younger brother and sister because his uncle Edwin had come back from exile himself and had killed his father, Oswald's father. It was all fairly internecine warfare. So King Edwin had returned, reclaimed the throne by killing Oswald's father, Athelfrith, who was one of the great pagan warriors of the warlords of the time, and his mum, Akka, rather than relying on the fond feeling of Uncle Edwin for his nephews, decided it was best to actually get out and go. And she went to Dalriada. Now, that's quite an interesting. Why should she go there, given that her husband had defeated the Dalriadans and actually killed the king's son in a previous battle? The most likely explanation is that she was actually also, they were related by blood. It's the really only tenable explanation for why they would have gone there and expected to not be killed. And also, from the point of view of the Dalriadans, having a potential king, an atheling, there at his court gave him another piece in the sort of power politics of the time. Because Oswald, growing up to be a man, was certainly a potential king, and if they could slot him in as a new king in Northumbria, they would have a powerful and reliable ally.
So he grows up as a Christian?
At some point, yeah. He went as a pagan. His family were pagan, but at some point in his teens, young manhood, became a Christian, and by all accounts seems to have been an extremely devout one.
Comes back to Northumberland, takes the crown, and brings Dalriadan warriors with him, apparently.
Yeah, there'll be a core of Dalriadan warriors who come back with Oswald. I mean, I think it's important to say that Oswald has been off in Ireland fighting wars in Ireland by this stage, so he's a seasoned warrior. He's not just a kid coming home to take the crown. He's got his own war band within the Dalriadan kingdom. He's sort of given lots of kudos really by the Dalriadan kings. He's a strong warrior in his own right by this stage, and not just the former child of a king. He's a warrior leader. He's a chieftain, I suppose.
And this archaeology, this is not a period in which we're blessed with superabundance of written material. So the archaeology that you're doing, this warrior, for example, I mean, this is filling in really exciting detail for this period.
Yeah, I mean, when the Romans withdraw their support for Britain, we sort of lose a lot of potential historical information, and then we just get sort of remote information from the continent. Really, there's little bits of information tied up in the Dalriadan kingdoms, in the censuses that are taken there, but really, the only information we get is written a century later, from Bede and people, monastic sources. So there's no sort of first-hand information that's been written down. It's all down to archaeology and remote people who never visited Britain writing about it, really.
And let's again focusing on your work in this cemetery, the warrior and the people around him. What is it telling us about this period after Oswald's return to his ancestral homeland?
It's an interconnected series of scientific incursions really into this into a group of the skeletons, the skeletal structure of these people. We just looked at one. Eddie and I, but the whole burial ground was looked at by the team that I work with. So we looked at C14 dating, isotopic analysis. So we looked at the teeth to work out where they were born, what they were eating, what kind of lifestyle they lived. So there's a whole range of DNA analysis done of of each skeleton and RNA. So you can look at what diseases they suffered from in their lifetime. So you can start to gradually, by piecing together the sort of leaves of science, build up a picture of what these individuals went through during the span of their life. So we're not just looking at an isolated skeleton. You're looking at the content of their DNA, the content of their RNA, the isotopes that go into building their teeth, and you can gradually sort of winkle that apart and find out a huge amount of information about these people. So we're getting to a stage where we can actually see a fleshed individual really in our mind's eye from the skeleton. So it's science is a really exciting point, I think, now when it's sort of taking over from basic archaeology, and we're going into that world of science where anything's on the table now. You can find out a huge amount. I mean, the scientists are absolutely amazing, some of the people I work with there.
And so they're telling us, as we said at the beginning, they're telling us these people lived pretty lives of plenty, but often met with violent ends. So quite a rich society, but it's one which is no stranger to warfare.
You're dealing with a group of individuals who they don't just wander around the kingdom on their own. They have a related relationship with their fellow warriors. They're isolated from society. They float above society really. They have weaponry that is specific to them. They have horses that they ride around on. They have food that specifically eat. They eat, breathe, drink, think, talk, sing, warfare. That's all they talk about. That's all they do when they're with their compatriots. But when they have downtime from weapons practice or from being at war, they play games that are associated with war. They tell tales about war. They have little jokes about war. You know, when you look at some of the what they call that, the limerick type things, the kennings and things, all those sorts of things that are all associated with war. Their gods are about war. Everything's about war. You know, that everything they wear is connected with their ability to fight. So these are elite people who exist on that one plane, and subsequently when they leave the sort of war band, they go off and have a normal life, I suspect. But for that one period, they're like elite athletes now. You know, they go off to a training camp and they exist in isolation with their friends, and that's all they talk and think about.
I'm interested that they're being buried in this cemetery with catastrophic wounds. Does that imply that the fighting occasionally reached the gates of Bamburgh, or does it mean that very high status warriors might be brought back from the battlefield to be interred in this place?
I think both. I mean, there's certainly warfare at Bamburgh, and I think you also need to remember that at this time, if two warriors have a disagreement, they don't write to the Times about it. They pull their swords out. So it's quite conceivable that this is a duel, or I've no idea really, but it could be a battle, it could be a skirmish, it could be a fight, it could be a defence, it could be a duel. I mean, we've got extensive information about the duelling system, about the number of shields that were allowed, and the general sort of form and format that these incredibly stylized fights take. So you're dealing with a group of people that they're not normal. They're completely atypical, really, compared to a general human being. So
this warrior may have been critical in helping to establish Northumberland as one of the preeminent kingdoms of Britain. Let's quickly tell the story. Let's quickly tell the very long and complicated story. Why does the south of England, why does Wessex end up becoming the foundation for the English state when it does develop? Sorry, it's a massive one.
Essentially, in that case, it was internecine warfare. They and the rise of Mercia. I mean, that's the two together.
I think that's part of it, and I think there's also the rise of the Roman Church as opposed to the Ionian Church. So you suddenly get the shift of focus away from Iona and Northumbria into Rome, and the Roman emissaries who are there from the Pope as opposed to the Ionian bishops. So I think that's part of it. And then you also, you get the Picts fighting heavily. You get a heavy loss.
The Battle of Nectansmere.
So Northumbrian army advances right the way up into the Highlands, we think, and it's almost obliterated.
It is obliterated, yeah. I mean, the king and all his... That's one of the most notable things about this time is battlefield defeats tended to be catastrophic. It wasn't just you could retreat in good order; you'd lose everyone. And in particular, it was because the king formed the centre of the line. He wasn't standing back; he was leading the battle. So he was both the rallying point, but also the focus for the enemy. Kill the king, and you won the battle. It's in fact. I mean, obviously, the battles in which the kings are killed are the ones that are recorded most, but it happens fairly often at this time that the preeminent warlord in the country dies in battle and his kingdom is lost. What makes Northumbria interesting, and particularly what Oswald did in his 8 years of rule, was it was the first time one of these kingdoms lost its king when Oswald lost and was killed by Penda, but yet the kingdom itself endured after him. What he had done in combination with the monks from Iona who'd come over and settled at Lindisfarne, was create something that could endure the death of its king. And that was the first time, really, that had happened. And that was the beginning of the creation of an enduring state and polity. And that's the crucial role, one of the crucial factors that Northumbria brought to Britain, was something, the beginnings of an enduring state and civilization that wasn't just the function of essentially having a really tough band of warriors at your side. And then when you died, it all falls apart. So that was key.
And if you're looking for a visual representation of that, something like the Staffordshire Hoard is probably the end product of losing a battle. So the swords are stripped down, the golden helmets are cut up, the crosses are all chopped into pieces and put into a box and carried away. So that's what I think the Staffordshire Hoard is. It's the remnants of a warrior elite that have been cut to pieces.
Yeah, there probably wasn't much left of the guys either, was there?
And then the coup de grace for Northumbria later is obviously the arrival of the Vikings, of the Norse, and Northumbria becomes one of the first kingdoms to be conquered by them. So
partly, I mean, we still get lots of Saxon activity or Anglian activity in the north of Northumbria, but the south becomes just part of a vassal Viking kingdom. But in the north, we still get an extension of that, and it becomes, obviously, at several points, it becomes Scottish. So the keep at Bamburgh is built by David, so the Scottish kings. It's very tempting to see the wall, Hadrian's Wall, as the point where England becomes Scotland. That's not the case in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's once the Romans, they don't leave, once they withdraw support, we go back to the tribal state, and the wall's just a piece of stone, basically.
Because Northumbria stretches regularly as far north as today's Edinburgh, doesn't it?
Yeah, up beyond Edinburgh and down, in some accounts, to beyond Elmet, almost down to Derby. So it's a vast kingdom at some points, and it's always contracting and expanding.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on basically how strong the current king is, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much. The book is called
Warrior: A Life of War in Anglo-Saxon Britain.
Perfect. Thank you very much for coming, guys.
Right, thank you.
I feel the hand of history upon our shoulders.
All this tradition of ours, our school history, our songs, this part of the history of our country, all were gone and finished and liquidated.